Hello, everybody. I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can see the PowerPoint. So I will be speaking today about ventilated hives versus condensing hives and the Hive Hugger insulation system, which did win the American Beekeeping Federation Innovation Award this year. So a little bit about me. I have been a registered nurse for 35 years, a beekeeper for 6. But it is my years as a nurse that did lay the foundation for why I'm here talking about beehive winterization. I have worked in the intensive care unit, chemotherapy, emergency room. I taught doctors and nurses the code blue protocols, when to defibrillate, when to push epi. And as a result, I have been intimately involved with hundreds of people fighting for their lives. Maybe it looked like doing chest compressions on them or giving chemotherapy to a 4-year-old. And it's changed me. I know in the core of my being how precious life is, and not just human life, all life. I haven't eaten meat in 14 years. So imagine how I felt that first spring as a new beekeeper in Minnesota when I opened some of my hives and found tens of thousands of dead bees. Their deaths were on me. I was their keeper, right? And I'm programmed to save lives. I cried. So the following years, I tried different winterization systems. These are not my hives, but they sure could have been because I tried many of these techniques. Including straw bales. What strikes me most as I look at these photos is we beekeepers will go through great lengths to help our bees survive the winter. And we struggle with just how best to do this. So despite trying multiple different winterization systems each year, I continue to lose about half of my hives. And I learned I wasn't alone. According to the University of Minnesota Bee Lab, 50 to 60% colony loss is the average in northern climates. And I just thought, can't we do better by our bees? And as serendipity would have it, I started dating a man who owns a business in high-tech insulation. And I thought, thank you, universe. So of course, I asked him to build me a high-tech insulation system for my bees. Right? It's a chance to prove his undying love for me. So he did not, but perhaps he did something better. He said, Peg, you do it. I believe in you. I got your back. And so that's how it all began. I mentioned I was the instructor of the Code Blue sequence, but I also was the instructor and nurse manager of the intensive care unit, where I would teach nurses how to care for these extremely complex, ill patients. And what I realized is everything we do in medicine to save lives is based in science. So as I started this quest to save honeybee lives, it was also important that it was based in science. Being I'm from Minnesota, my first stop on this quest was the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. And when I asked them if they could give me any guidance, they said, look into the research of Bill Heschbeck. He's a master beekeeper, engineer, author. This is an article he wrote in Bee Culture on Winter Management. But he's kind of the pioneer or the godfather of teaching about the condensing hive. So I have since got to know Bill. He's become a mentor of mine. In fact, he's used the Hive Hugger for a couple of years now, gives it 2 thumbs up. But besides Bill Heschbeck, Randy Oliver, Etienne Tardif, Derek Mitchell, Tom Seeley, I did a pretty deep dive into the scientific research on overwintering, and I was struck by the fact that it's plentiful, it's consistent, it's current, and frankly, it's gotten quite high tech. For example, infrared thermal imaging. And now we can peek inside of a beehive and get an idea on where there's heat loss, where's the cluster, how big is it moving? So data that we didn't have years ago. And then there's the whole science that's birthed from having temperature and humidity sensors in the hive. These are broodminder, but this little rectangle can give readings every 10 minutes. So I just want to share some of the research done by Etienne Tardif. He's a beekeeper, engineer, researcher in the Yukon. Some of you maybe heard him speak, brilliant man. But he'll put 20 of these sensors in a single hive, and then he'll do that for many hives, and then just change the winterization system. Insulated, not insulated, ventilated, not ventilated, small ventilation hole, bigger ventilation hole. And as a result, he gets millions of data points. This is his slide from his talk. And basically, every few inches, he can tell you what's going on thermodynamically in the hive in the winter. For example, here's a ventilation channel, right? Here's the cluster. This is how big is it? This is how it's moving. And based on different winterization systems. So there's really no longer a mystery what's going on inside a hive thermodynamically. The data's there. And I want to for sure call out that as I've delved into the research, clearly there's a lot of reasons for winter colony loss besides how did you insulate or how didn't you insulate? How did you manage moisture? There's varroa, diseases. How did you prep them nutritionally going into winter? How is your queen? Is she failing? And then just weak hive in general going into the winter. But I thought, you know, if we could come up with an amazing winterization system, that perhaps we could put a dent in that 55% mortality in the winter, it was worth a try. The biggest and, excuse my pun, most heated debate I came across amongst beekeepers is, what is the bigger cause of winter mortality? Is it wet, moist bees? Is it the moisture? Or is it the cold? And if I surveyed all of you, my guess is it would be split as to the answer. And you would all be right. It's both. And we need to solve for both. And in order to talk about how to solve for both, I found it's helpful to use a relatable life example to look into thermodynamics. So let's all say we're going to take a road trip to the Yukon in January. So we all pile in this bus, and it's a long drive. So we have many, many hours in which we're just talking about beekeeping. So as a result, there's just a lot of hot air in the bus. Pretty soon, the windows start to condense. We can't see outside anymore. Side question, what is the temperature of the windows for this condensation to be collecting? Dew point. So dew point is a really important concept to understand for later. Dew point is the temperature in which water vapor turns into liquid water. As we're all sitting here digesting our supper, a byproduct of our metabolism is water vapor. When that water vapor in the air hits a surface in the room, could be a can of pop or a window, when it hits a surface in the room cold enough to be at the dew point, water vapor turns into liquid water and condensation forms. So what do we do about this condensation in the bus? How do we get rid of it? Well, we ventilate, right? The bus driver turns on the vent, brings in fresh air. We crack the windows. Pretty soon, condensation clears up. We can see. But now what's happening in the bus, right? It's getting cold because as that moist air leaves, what leaves with it? Heat. So let's bring this into a beehive. Like humans, a byproduct of the bee's metabolism is also water vapor. According to Randy Oliver, for every pound of honey eaten, the bees produce 1 1/4 cups of water, and a percentage of that is water vapor. So like on the bus, as the bees, water vapor starts to condense down on the surfaces, and as it starts to condense down off the ceiling and drips down on our bees, right? Wet bees are dead bees. So what do many beekeepers do to solve for this problem? They ventilate, like on the bus, crack the windows. They drill holes in the hive boxes, or might use a quilt box with holes in it. The inner cover has a notched hole in it. But now what's happening with the bees, right? They're getting cold. And this diagram by Derek Mitchell shows that there's this stacking or chimney effect that occurs where the air moves in and through the hive, and the hot, moist air leaves and exposes the bees to a lot of cold exposure. So in the bus, no problem for us to be cold because we can just turn on the heat. We have a gas-powered engine. But in a beehive, the bees are the gas. And how do they generate heat? They form a cluster. Queen is in the middle. And then they vibrate their wing muscles like a shivering response to generate heat. Here's a nice thermographic photo of a heater bee. If some of you lost your hives in the spring and then when you opened them up, found these bees with their little bottoms sticking out, these are heater bees. But the research shows that this shivering response to generate heat comes with a pretty high price tag. This quote is by Bill Heschbeck in one of the talks he gave, and he basically says, in a non-insulated, ventilated hive, the bees have to put forth an extraordinary amount of effort to keep the colony alive all winter, and they will pay for it by dying earlier in the spring. This graph came from a study done in Australia, and I'll just orient you. This is temperature in Celsius. And this is metabolic output by the bees. And this is the temperature where they start to sort of shiver. In Fahrenheit, it's in the 60s, low 60s. But once the bees start going into a shivering response, the colder it gets, their metabolic rate skyrockets. And contrast that to their metabolic rate in the warmer temperatures where shivering's not happening. They're huge difference in their metabolic rate. So big takeaway, asking our bees to go into this heating mode is stressful. Etienne calls it metabolic stress can lead to metabolic death. Other detrimental effects of cold and ventilation on the bees. This is Etienne's data. At about 50 to 55 degrees, the bees start to cluster. At about 14 degrees, that cluster tightens down to a point where it can't get any tighter. Its capacity to generate heat and survive the cold taps out. And if the cold threat, the cold exposure continues, that outer layer of bees will go into a chill coma, and they'll just start dropping off the cluster until you've just got a pile of dead bees at the bottom of your hive. Or this cluster is so tight because of the cold, it can't even move anymore. And many of you might have had this happen. You open your hive and there's this cluster of dead bees literally an inch away from honey. And you're like, oh, they starved to death. Well, no, they froze to death because they were too cold to even access their honey an inch away. However, starving to death in the winter is also a common issue, but what that looks like is the bees are so cold, they're just consuming a bunch of honey to generate energy, to generate heat, and they will just go through all their winter stores in order to survive because they needed it because they were cold. Another negative effect of the cold and ventilation is this increased honey consumption. Like I said, the colder they get, the more honey they'll consume and the more water they'll consume. And as a result, they have increased waste products. And at least in Minnesota, where I'm from, there's not a lot of opportunities for cleansing flights. So increased waste means more risk for dysentery, risk of spreading nosema. So this negative cascade on the health and well-being of your bees due to cold and ventilation. This next component of research that I came across is Derek Mitchell. And again, he's a researcher. He's got his PhD at Leeds University in thermal fluids. He's done a lot of great research and published a lot in the bee journals. But basically, he said that the cluster is a survival mechanism we impose on our bees, that in natural colonies and well-insulated hives, the bees don't cluster at all. They're in their loosey-goosey roaming around the hive. And Etienne's research, again, he's in Yukon, validates that. He said in his hives, in well-insulated, non-ventilated hives, the bees' resting metabolism, they're just being alive, being bees, is enough to maintain their internal environment. So huge implications for like the health and well-being of our bees, what we do to them, making them cluster versus a really well supported environment, big difference in their well-being. And so here's the research if you guys want to look it up. And I give you the reference at the end too. Other detrimental effects of cold and ventilation that a lot of beekeepers aren't aware of is that in the spring, where the temperatures start to get a little warmer, queen starts laying eggs. These old, and I say old because this graph comes from Randy Oliver, where he sort of charts out the ages of bees over the season. And these blue portions are the winter bees. And so come spring, the winter bees are like 200 days old. So come spring, queen starts laying eggs, old, tired, especially tired if it wasn't a cold hive, like they've been working hard all winter. Now they need to activate their glands and take care of baby bees. And they need to heat the brood to 95 degrees, which is a big ask. If you've got a bit of a cold spring or a cold snap and they can't maintain that 95 degrees, they'll just quit trying. And without replacement brood to replace these old winter bees, your colony will perish. So super important time, if you insulate, keep it on till May, right? There's no reason to not. The bees can use that protection in this very vulnerable time of year. Another not well-known risk of ventilating on your bees is life-threatening dehydration, because bees need water to dilute and metabolize honey, and without it, they can starve. And so there's reports of bees making desperate attempts to leave the hive to bring back water. So the research I did, clearly ventilating, yes, it gets rid of moisture, but in doing so, hurts our bees. It gets rid of precious water and leads to life-threatening detrimental cold exposure. And it looks like the bees agree. You see them propolizing up these entrances. This is an apimae hive, and I hear many reports of the bees propolizing up the vents in the apimae hive. So clearly, ventilating does not solve for both. So the common question asked is, well, without ventilating, how do we manage the moisture in the hive? Right? Wet bees are dead bees. And the answer is insulate. And so, but in a really particular way, which brings us back to dew point. The key to keeping them warm and dry is simply super insulate the top of the hive. Because when that's super insulated, the ceiling stays warm, right? Stays above the dew point, so stays dry. Meanwhile, you also insulate the sides of the hive, but not as much. So there's a differential between the top and the sides, so that when condensation happens in the hive, which it will, because we want it to, so when condensation does happen, it will condense on the cooler sides. John Gott is a master beekeeper out east, and this research study was published in American Bee Journal just a couple years ago. What he did is he took his hives, put like a glass, sort of plexiglass on top of the hive, and then he top insulated some and not others. And then into the winter some, he opened up the hives and took a photo. The hive on the left is top insulated, and you can see very little condensation, if any, just on the periphery, but the bees stayed dry. Versus the hive without top insulation, full of condensation. Many of you know Randy Oliver. He's a researcher in California, world famous, and has just made amazing contributions to the well-being of bees and beekeepers with all the research. And this is what he has to say about this topic.
Yes, but you made the comment that competencies might not have value.
Yeah.
Why would you say that?
Because looking at all the research, there's very few places in the world where there's been any findings that suggest they actually do have a value. When you put a top entrance and a bottom entrance in, that's like, imagine you live in a 2-story house during winter. Don't take my word for this. Try this, okay? Is it cold at your area now?
Yes.
Okay, so turn off the heater, open the front door, and open the top window, and see how it feels living in that house.
What about the moisture content? How's the condensation getting out of the hive?
So there's no reason for condensation if the hive is insulated enough. So generally, top insulation will put the condensation to the outside of the hive, to the where it reaches dew point temperature. That's the moisture the bees need in order to have enough moisture during the winter.
Okay, well said. So insulate. And the next question is, well, how much, right? We've got to have a differential more on the top than the sides, but how much? And so to quantify insulation, I want to just define R value because that's how it's measured. R stands for resistance. So how much resistance does a material offer against heat loss? And it compares an inch of one material against an inch of another material. And here is a slide that just shows various R values of common beehive insulation products or materials. Tar paper, 0. Wood chips, straw, snow, 1 to 2. Cardboard and fiberglass, 3 to 4. Foam boards, 4 to 5, depending on what kind you get. But people will be like, oh my gosh, cardboards are 3, 4, that's amazing. But we have to remember R value refers to an inch of that material. So that would be an inch of cardboard, which would be a lot. So the first answer on how much to insulate is it depends where you live, right? Clearly, you know, the climate zone here is very different than the needs of climate zone up there. So that's something to take into consideration. So as I looked at the research on quantifying insulation, there were a lot of good studies. So I'll just share some of what I found. This was an older study done in Egypt, but they basically did no insulation, like a sackcloth, and then foam boards. And the conclusion of the study basically said there was a significant increase in hive temperature, honey, and sealed brood using foam as an insulator. And I couldn't find in the study how much they used. And so I'm including this anyway, because it's just compelling to see the data on without insulation versus insulation, that it's statistically significant in these metrics. But then another study I found at the University of Illinois, and they did basically no insulation compared to insulated hives. And the insulated hives, again, colony survival improved by 22.5% by insulating. There was a 2-fold reduction in bee death. Remember earlier, like metabolic stress of cold bees will lead to metabolic death, like they will die sooner. This study said, yep, absolutely, they will. In the cold, uninsulated hives, the bees died faster than in insulated hives. And lastly, they consumed the insulated hives significantly less honey stores. And they insulated their hives with R10 on top and 1 on the sides. But this is climate zone 5-7, which huge impact in that climate zone, but maybe not super helpful. Again, I'm Minnesota, we're zone 3-4. So I kept looking for more data. Came across this study, Seeley and Morse. Tom Seeley's a PhD professor of biology at Cornell, very well written a lot of books, speaks at the bee conferences. But they asked the question, in northern climates, when bees naturally seek out a home for themselves to overwinter in, what are the qualities of those enclosures? And it was consistent. And basically, this research found that they liked live trees with very thick, solid walls and sort of infinite amount of insulation on top of the enclosure or their opening or their hive space. Again, sort of like, remember, lots of top insulation, keep it above dew point. And then no ventilation, no top entrances. They preferred enclosures just with openings at the bottom. And I like to show this photo by Bill Heschbeck showing a Langstroth hive. This is less than an inch of pine, right? What we overwinter them in compared to a natural tree enclosure. I mean, many, many inches of wood. And then Seeley and Radcliffe just last year took that previous study kind of to a whole nother level. And they did a deep dive into looking at the natural enclosures of bees. And based on that, like, how should we insulate based on what bees do? Let's get some quantification. And so the recommendations to make it much closer to a natural home for a honeybee. Their findings said, again, no surprise, no ventilating, no upper entrances, R30 on the ceiling. So now we're getting some quantification quantifying insulation in these colder climates, and R30 on the walls. And then Etienne Tardif, I mentioned earlier, engineer, researcher, speaker. He's in the Yukon and he gets amazing survival for that climate zone. And this is his slide, again, by permission. But he also no top ventilation, R30, top of the hive, similar to the Sealy recommendation, and then the walls 10 to 20. But this is validating that he uses a condensing wall on purpose, lower R value. So again, let the condensation happen in the hive, but make it happen on the walls. Keep it off the top. So some consistent recommendations now. And so at looking to develop an insulation system for climate zone 1 through 5, right? Etienne's up here, Sealy studies done in New York, zone 5, Minnesota 3-4. I went with, the R, close to R30 and R10 for the product. And so it's called the Hive Hugger. And I've spent a lot of time doing the science behind a condensing hive, because a Hive Hugger is a condensing hive system. And I recognize this is a bit of a paradigm shift, and people aren't used to this, not ventilating, but insulating instead. So I really think it's important that people understand the science behind the design. So it comes in 2 components, basically the top panel and the side wraps. The top panel's a result of my partner's influence, the high-tech insulation support, because there's this thing called a vacuum insulation panel. It is the highest R value material ever created, and it's crazy high. It is 10 times more efficient than foam board or fiberglass. Here's a graph showing the difference, and the reason for that is it's a vacuum panel. Think of thermoses. In a vacuum, there's no air molecules, and without air molecules, no heat transfer, like no heat loss can take place. So extremely efficient insulator. And these bullet points come from the manufacturer. Like I mentioned, 10 times the R value than traditional insulation materials. Refrigerators who have these vacuum panels, which your refrigerator probably does, you hope it does, because they're 50% more efficient. And these are being used in shipping containers because the contents, whether it needs to stay hot or cold, will stay at a constant temperature for 5 days. And if they aren't punctured, again, it's a vacuum panel. If they're not punctured, they will last up to 50 years. If they do get punctured, they will become bendy. The panels themselves, as you can see, they're very rigid. So you will know it, but they are encased in a puncture-proof covering. So puncturing is very unlikely. And so if you take care of your panel, it will last you your lifetime. I just found this a little bit funny. Does the world need an $800 vacuum insulated cooler? Yeti says yes. So if you have this expensive cooler, it has vacuum insulation panels in it. So wherever you need high R value in a small space, vacuum insulation panels are amazing. And now they've made it to the bee industry. So the panel that was custom made for the beehive, and again, these are high tech, like you can't get vacuum insulation panels from Home Depot. These are custom made, and there's a lot to make that happen. But anyway, so instead of having it an inch, I went with 3/4 of an inch because we really only need the R32 on top. And so, right, we want to keep the ceiling above the dew point. And again, 75% of the heat loss is also the top of the hive. So that's where you want your heavy hitter insulation. You know, some of the insulation on the market, they just do the wraparound, but they don't really address top insulation. So if you're going to insulate one place on your hive, insulate the top. And you in climate zones, 5, 6, 7, maybe could get away with just top insulation. So that's the top panel. I do want to just say that there's nothing magical, although it's sort of magical about this panel, but you can easily get R30, like Etienne in the Yukon. He just puts an empty hive box on top of his beehive boxes, and then just stacks 6 or 7 inches of foam board. Boom, you've got your R30. And then do, an R, 1.5 to 2 inch around the sidewalls, and you've got your condensing hive. And so I'm really here to say, the science says there's a better outcomes if you insulate like this, and you can definitely do a DIY. This is more convenient, but not necessary. So that was the top panel. The side panels are just off the shelf, Home Depot expanded polystyrene foam board. And for this, the Hive Hugger, we are going with 1.5 inch. We have a standard density, which is about an R7, and then a high density, which is R8. But you add the wooden box, which brings the side to about an R8-9. But what's nice is these side panels are professionally water jet cut. So they click together. So really super easy to assemble and put on, especially like I was by myself a lot of time as a beekeeper. So I had a hard time winterizing by myself. So ease of assembly and putting on was important. Other specific design features that were intentional: foil faced both sides. And the question is, well, like, why not black? And from what I've learned in the research is you really just don't want your bees dependent on solar gain for heat, because clearly at night, vulnerable. Series of cloudy days, vulnerable. And I also learned that, if you have a black covering during the sunny days, it warms and the bees sort of uncluster, and then at night they cluster, and then they uncluster and cluster, and that those diurnal swings and this clustering unclustering is stressful for them. And I want to just show you what this looks like a little bit. And I will, so these are from those green rectangle sensors. This is just the date, and this is the temperature inside the hive. So every squiggly line is a different hive. There's a sensor in each of these hives. This pink dotted line is the outside temperature. And so the 2 top lines are Hive Hugger hives. And these bottom ones, like the blue and red, are tar paper. And you can see with these, swings in temperature with, day, night, day, night, day, night, versus if you just don't do black. You don't need black because we shouldn't be dependent on the sun. But if you just provide really good, lots of insulation, your bees just get this nice, steady, stable winter support. And the foil being also on the inside facing the hive, is there is heat loss coming from the box, but it hits against the foil, and then that radiant heat gets reflected back into the beehive. So double benefit of foil facing on your foam boards, especially the inside facing the hive box. Another specific design feature is it only comes in single and double deeps, not triple deeps. And this is very intentional and science-based. This particular study was based out of Egypt, where they just looked at different sizes of overwintering bees, and the conclusion of the study is it was observed that the maximum values of hive temperature, honey, pollen, and brood were achieved by using the smallest beehive size. And Etienne, again, I know I reference him a lot, but he's done amazing research. He basically says the amount of the bees you have to the volume of hive space is critical. If you have too few bees in too big a volume, it'll result in winter failure. And so, assess your bees in the fall. I mean, ideally, you'd have an idea of, and obviously there's drones and a lot of them are summer bees that will, so what's going to be going into winter is probably smaller than what you've even got in fall. And then sort of match the amount of bees you have to the hive box you overwinter in. Etienne in the Yukon gets his best overwintering success in single deeps. So the smaller you can get away with, the better for your bees. I mean, think about, do you want to heat a little bungalow, or would you rather heat an entire mansion, like a 3-story mansion? It's just intuitive that the smaller the space, the better for the bees. Well, that's really kind of the nuts and bolts of the Hive Hugger. And people kind of wanted to know, like, well, how do you set it up? How do you put it on your bees? And so first off, it is not a ventilated hive. It's a condensing hive. So plug all upper ventilation holes and trim the plugs so that they're flush with the hive, so the board rests against the wood. And again, no moisture absorbing materials in the hive. We want moisture to condense. It's a condensing hive model. Next, invert the entrance reducer to the 4 3/4 opening. Invert it and then set it at that opening. And the reason is you're going to have bees die over the winter. And so when they collect on the bottom board, that you can have a fair amount of bees pile up before they plug up the lower entrance. I mean, if you're going to be keeping an eye on your hives all winter and want to kind of clean out the entrance, then of course you can invert it upright. But if you aren't going to be like really tightly keeping an eye on them, then we recommend inverting it. And then put on your mouse guard. We use just these wire mesh, works great, but it doesn't matter. But in Minnesota, we definitely put on a mouse guard. And then moving to the top of the hive, this is your wooden inner cover sitting on top of your hive boxes. And then this little Reflectix insulation panel, we have sit on top of the hole to keep your bees down in the hive. And because then this high-tech, high R-value panel sits on top of the wooden inner cover. And we ask, and so this comes with the kit. We also give you a little roll of Tyvek because it's important that you seal tape around. I mean, it can be any tape because we want this notched hole covered. And then we want any seams that might be a source of heat loss to be taped. Seen a lot of bee boxes that are chipped or warped and, kind of tough shape. And so we just don't want air gaps. So tape around the seam once they're sort of tucked in for the winter. And then the last component, once you've got your top panel on, you can see here, tape around it. And then you can either put all 4 panels together and slip it over. I mean, they have to be a little bit loose, slip it over the top, or you can put 3 on from the back of the hive and then add the last panel. And then it comes with these corner guards, strap holders, and it comes with a nylon belt, just secured in place. So that's really it for setup guide. It's quick and it's easy. It's way less time consuming than a lot of other DIY approaches. So I wanted to share a little bit about the data that we've done on the product so far. at the beginning of the talk, I told you that I went to the University of Minnesota to ask for advice on my insulation system goal of building an insulation system. And so once I had the first prototype developed, and obviously I'd done a ton of research, I went back to the U and I said, oh, this is what I came up with. And they were gracious enough to have me test some on their hives. This is me at the U. So that first year, I actually ventilated half of them and not ventilated the other half, kind of like, you know, that wanting to see the ventilated versus non-ventilated. And surprisingly, actually, 50% survival was all that the ventilated hives got. And some of these were the U of M. But curiously, and this is heavy hitter insulation, right? But Etienne, who has the same R values, maybe even more, when he ventilated his hives, he said the results were disastrous. So good information. But the true condensing hive, the Hive Hugger hives that were not ventilated, 90% survival. And again, the first year, I had the 10 out in the field that were not ventilated, and this is some of the broodminder from those hives. I have a friend in Wisconsin who does cutouts. He's who introduced me to broodminder. And so these are his hives. And the top two lines are actually Hive Hugger, because I sent him a couple prototypes. And then these other colored lines are just his hives. And again, pink is outside temperature. But in January, he called me up. He said, Peg, you need to look at the broodminder data. The Hive Hugger hives are running 20 to 35 degrees warmer than his hives. And these actually are also insulated condensing hives, just not as much. He uses our 10 on top and 5 on the sides. But those high R values were significantly warmer than the other hives. But the other compelling data is he weighs his hives in the fall and in the spring, and he said the Hive Hugger hives consumed 50% less honey, which makes sense, right? They're warmer, they're running significantly warmer all winter. They're going to just consume less honey because they don't need it for the energy for heat. He said when he opened the hives in the spring, it was like a sauna, like all this heat came rushing out. So based on that first year of data, I did, the University of Minnesota told me about a grant that they are involved in, and it went as far as to write a letter of recommendation for me to do like a big formal study. And this is a photo of that SARE grant study: Bee Cozy, tar paper, Reflectix, Hive Hugger. And the original grant was, and I had a grant partner, these are actually her hives, was going to be 80 hives, just a massive study. But unfortunately, due to my partner having COVID and some other issues, we were unable to finish the study. And so all I got, or all I can share, is of the 20 Hive Hugger hives, and all of the hives were well managed, there was over 90% survival. So similar as previous year's data, but just more numbers. And so this is the broodminder data from the SARE grant, hives that we did get information on. Again, you saw this earlier, top two are Hive Hugger, and these are all the other insulation systems. And all of these were ventilated. So anywhere from 15 to 50 degrees warmer. And another piece of data that I think is sort of fun, done last year besides the SARE grant, these I call all comers because there were like 30 hives that random beekeepers tested my system for me. I have no idea, did they test or treat for mites? I have no idea how much honey they left. They were just out there. But in the spring, I circled back with them all and I said, how'd your bees do? And there was about a 28% hive loss with the Hive Hugger. But remember, the average loss for all comers in northern climates is 55%. So one can make the deduction that heavy hitter insulation can decrease that 55% by a significant amount. Again, the numbers aren't huge, but compelling. And honestly, a lot of the beekeepers, when I checked in, said, yeah, I think they got robbed in the fall, or yeah, I put your system on my weakest hive. So they're clearly, or I didn't really do much for mites. So it's entirely likely that this big portion of the colony loss was not from cold exposure, but from other reasons. Other feedback from the all-comers. This beekeeper said he's been beekeeping for 5 years, never had a more robust spring hive inspection. When he opened the hive in the spring, it looked like a colony in August. It was so full of honey and brood still. Again, remember, 50% less honey consumption. I mean, what a deal to open your hive in the spring and have extra honey. This beekeeper did Hive Hugger versus Bee Cozy, much larger number of bees surviving, way ahead with bee buildup in the spring. So future research this coming winter, because the SARE grant didn't get to complete it, I'm putting the monetary energy and the equipment into 5 different beekeepers apiaries, including the University of Minnesota. Thank you for that. And so 65 hives will be studied, comparing Hive Hugger to a ventilated, not insulated hive. And then also doing 150 all-comers. There's 150 Hive Huggers out in the field that all agreed to give me feedback in the spring. So I can add that to the all-comers data as well. So thank you all for, being a part of that. If any of you are watching this, I appreciate that. So the big takeaways from my review of the literature and from my own personal research in looking at this topic, the takeaways are that a well-insulated condensing winter setup is a significant factor in ensuring overwintering success. Decreases mortality, stronger spring colonies, queen starts laying earlier, less honey consumption, and then the bees have access to their much needed water. I just added this to the PowerPoint because in talking to beekeepers after this presentation, or I give a lot of bee talks, this is some common questions. So first, clearly manage your mites and diseases so that the hive is healthy going into winter, because no insulation can prevent colony loss if you're infested with varroa or your bees are sick. So it can help with cold exposure, but it can't help with that. Do not set your hive boxes on cement or concrete. The hive will lose heat through contact with those materials. Provide 80, and again, this is zone 1 to 5, 80 to 100 pounds of honey. I can tell you they won't need that much, but honey provides thermal mass. Like it retains the heat. So it's really helpful for the bees that way too. So avoid leaving empty frames in your hive box. And again, this is for a double deep. If you're overwintering in a single deep with fewer bees, 60 to 80 pounds. Be mindful of late feeding. The honey needs to cure. And then now spring management, consider a pollen patty after the first cleansing flight to encourage brood rearing. So just a few tips. And then these are my references, and I'm happy to share them with you if you want to take a little deeper dive. And people have taken me up on this into the research yourself. I'm happy to share them with you. So my website, if you want to learn more about any of this, or you can email me or message me through Facebook. thank you all for being present for this. I do want to tell you, I am still working as a nurse. I'm going to be 59 this year, and thought I'd be retiring right soon. And I find myself now doing a startup business at my age. I don't know why, but I've loved every minute of it. Like, I love research. I love beekeepers. So it's been really rewarding. And maybe I'm supposed to transition out of saving human lives and focus on saving honeybee lives instead. And I do want to share that that young boy I had a picture of, he had metastatic liver cancer when I met him. And I was his chemo nurse, obviously, but he survived. He beat the odds. He's doing good. And so I just want to leave you with the original message of life is precious. And so take good care of each other, take good care of your bees. And with that, I will close. And like I said, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions. Since this isn't live, message me or email me. I'm very open to helping problem solve. All right, gonna sign off now. Thank you so much.